the breathtaking purge of people from social media that has been taking place, geez, I don't know exactly how many hours it would be, but since sometime yesterday, there has been a breathtaking purge. That purge has included the president. It has included the president not only in his private account, but his official presidential account and every other account he would attempt to use to communicate. And this has been, of course, cheered by all sorts of people who, see only if this is bad for Trump, then I like it. Who are, of course,
somehow forgetting that censorship that you like is always followed by censorship that you don't.
Right. Either they never learned about the Rawlsian veil of ignorance, or they've forgotten the lesson, but my goodness, is this going to be used in ways that you don't like down the road? And there's a question about why it's happening in the way it is. Of course, many of the people who are being tossed off the major platforms are conservatives. And the problem is that lulls a lot of people who are not conservatives into imagining that whatever is going on is an academic concern because it won't come for them. But
right.
Let me point out a couple things about it. One, hey, Zach, could you put up the screenshot of the Articles of Unity account? So this is a screenshot from today of the Articles of Unity Twitter account. The Articles of Unity Twitter account was the official account of the Unity movement that at the time was advancing a plan to fend off both the Republicans and the Democrats and put the presidency in the hands of a left-right partnership team that would be above politics and non-ideological.
And actually patriotic.
Actually patriotic. The three characteristics were capable, courageous patriots. That was the qualifications for the job. Now,
I feel like a few of those people still remain.
A few of those people still remain. They do. But here's the point. If you think that this censorious instinct of Twitter and Facebook and Google is about people whose beliefs we all understand to be anathema, wrong, dangerous, etc., then you need to grapple with the fact that it is only months ago that these very same entities took up arms against a decidedly nonpartisan, non-ideological effort, which you may have liked, you may have disliked it, but the point is they availed themselves of the right to close down this account. Why did they do it? Well, they said we violated the rules. We went through an intense investigation to find evidence of what they had said we had done. It wasn't there. It didn't result in them unsuspending the account. It remains suspended. So this account was suspended without a justifiable explanation and remains so to this day, right? That tells you something. Now, I wish we had more examples. There are a few, but I wish we had more examples of a high profile so that people could understand that while it's going to tell you what it's doing is getting rid of dangerous conservatives who are espousing views that will cause people, will cause harm, what it is really doing is getting rid of people that are inconvenient for it. And yes, many of those people are conservatives, but it is not in any way the thing that is at the center of these purges.
And the Overton window of what is inconvenient will, of course, shift.
The Overton, well, it will be shifted to whatever is convenient. And I would point out, hey, Zach, can you put up the the tweet about Facebook? Okay, so here is another case. This is not about Articles of Unity officially, but viewers will remember that my Facebook account, which I barely used, at one point I was a user of Facebook, but walked away from it largely after the Evergreen debacle. Facebook tossed me off, said that they had already done an internal review, that there was no going back, that I was permanently having my account suspended. I raised a ruckus publicly, which brought down a lot of heat on them, and then they gave a preposterous explanation and said I had triggered algorithms that were looking for inauthentic behavior, and they were sorry. Now, I learned this on Twitter. I never got any official communication or anything. Now, okay, that's
and without your audience, you would have had no recourse.
Right. Okay, so I have 400 plus thousand Twitter followers. That allows me to generate a fair amount of heat. But the point is, the very same weapons are directed at people who just don't happen to be lucky enough to have that many followers, and so they remain suspended. And our good friend Jordan Greenhall has been suspended from Facebook without explanation. I believe he remains suspended. The Dr. Rollergator satire account was suspended for saying
It was
things.
caps, wasn't it? Suspended for using caps?
He was suspended for not using his indoor voice. I mean,
crocodiles never use their indoor voice.
Yeah, crocodilians, they don't have an indoor voice.
No, I don't know what the pretense was. I'm not sure that the guy who runs the account, ever found out either.
Well, there were some tweets they wanted him to remove, but tellingly, the very things in those tweets that they claimed violated their rules were quotes of other accounts that were still up and had not been suspended for saying them. So anyway, a completely preposterous and inconsistent explanation. But Zach, do you want to? So this also is not just about tech platforms. You want to show the Harper's screenshot? So this, I have not had time to delve deeply here. I learned about this just before the live stream. This person was fired shortly after writing this article for Harper's. I started reading it.
Wait, this is from 2018?
Am I missing something?
Well, it says 2018, archive 2018.
I hope I'm not making an error here.
I don't see that.
She's talking about in the URL.
So Walter Kern is an excellent writer, and he used to do a lot of the opening essays. I don't know anything about this story at all. But anyway, you may. I don't know what you're going to say about this. I don't know about this story.
You're raising a question. I don't want to make a mistake if I'm getting wind of something now that is actually not relevant to our current situation. But even if this story is not what I thought it was, we have at least one case of a musician being canceled by their record company, the record label, for apparently the crime of holding conservative viewpoints. So anyway, what are we to make of all this? Well, a couple things. One, I would point out we are living in a completely novel circumstance that is not anticipated by our Constitution, and we are forever caught in the following bind. We hold freedom of speech as a high value, but we are arbitrarily held to the protections that were delivered to us by the founders, who could not possibly have imagined a world of tech platforms that would control the equivalent of paper and ink. And
right, they only knew to name the press in the First Amendment, for instance.
Well, they knew to protect us from government incursion, which they saw as the most dangerous threat to the freedom of exchange. And the problem is, and this is a place where conservatives inevitably trip up, which is, okay, free speech is important. Why? It's important because it is the mechanism through which we hash out what is true, what we must consider. It is basically the realm in which nuance is dealt with. There's a ton of garbage in speech. Probably most things that are spoken are garbage. But the point is, you cannot separate out the fact of heterodox speech from nonsense speech. There is no rule you can apply. There's nobody with expertise good enough to surgically separate the two so that what you're left with is the high quality heterodoxy, and you are freed from the noise, right? It can't be done. It's not a job that can be done. In light of the fact that it can't be done, we have to be free to talk about anything and everything. And then in retrospect, we can say what the important heterodoxy was. So just simply the idea of free speech is important. Okay, once you have the idea that free speech is necessary to the functioning of a society like ours, especially one in which consent of the governed is the basis of legitimate government, then the question is, how do you protect it? And the fact that the founders protected us from government incursion and didn't protect us from private incursion is just an accident of history. The fact is, the heterodox speech needs to be protected in the environment in which it takes place. And conservatives will very frequently say, well, these are private platforms. They're entitled to bar people as they will. And the answer is actually this analysis doesn't hold. For one thing, they're private platforms in a sense, but they are traveling on an internet that we publicly financed the construction of, right? What's more, they function as a public square.
Especially in the era of COVID. I mean, even more so. And we will go back to a moment in which we can actually convene in a public square. But they are, for many of us, the only thing we've got.
Well, even at the point that the public square is, again, the public square doesn't have the scale
Right.
in order to allow us to have a conversation at the scale at which we need to be governed.
Right.
And so the idea of these private concerns having absolutely arbitrary rights to interfere with anybody's speech, including the president's, and yes, the president can hold a press conference, but where will that press conference be seen? How many people will get wind of it? In effect, yes, there's a technical ability to speak, you can shout out your window, and if people really want to hear you, maybe they'll, come stand outside your building. But that is not a meaningful challenge to the control that the tech platforms now have. And I would point out that, in effect, what conservatives are very likely to leap on, which is the essentially private property rights that are the basis of the argument that if you own a platform, you don't have to let just anybody speak on it, and obviously that's true at one level. If you and I started a small, mom and pop publishing house, we don't have to publish anybody who, wants to throw a manifesto our way. But these things are functioning in a different way. They although Twitter and Facebook and Google are not monopolies individually, because each one has the other in its sphere. Together, they effectively function as a monopoly, and they are acting in concert here to limit the access of certain voices to the audience.
Right. And I mean, one piece of evidence to that point in the last 72 hours is that the conservative-leaning alternative to Twitter, Parler, has had its app removed by Google from whatever the equivalent of the Google, the Apple Store over on Google is, and apparently Apple is likely to do the same thing from the Apple Store. So, at the point that that there is a competitor to Twitter, but it has an ideological bent that may be the mirror image of what Twitter's ideological bent is, at least in terms of what the CEO is willing to do and say. The fact that other big tech is willing to step in and say, no, we won't distribute, we won't facilitate this thing being out there in the world, that looks like collusion.
Yep.
And it looks, it's not actually the legal meaning of the term monopoly. It's not monopolistic, but it's a kind of de facto monopoly.
It's a de facto monopoly, and the fact that you don't have any diversity about political leanings of these gigantic platforms and tech companies. The idea that Apple and Twitter, because they are traveling in the same political circles, can act in concert. Oh, Twitter's going to shove you off Twitter. Maybe you go to Parler, and then Apple's going to shut down Parler, right? So the point is, it's functioning as a monopoly, right? And if the law isn't caught up to it, then we need to fix the law. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is you've got the blue team, which is now in control of 2 of the 3 official branches of government. Right? It's in control of, or will be in control of, the executive and both houses of Congress. The courts are still potentially independent, but this reduces checks and balances.
Well, and that's an interesting use of the term independent. What you mean is, sort of red team.
I don't really mean red team. Okay. I just mean not.
So you're not talking about the Supreme Court particularly. You're talking about the courts across the land. There's a diversity of political leanings of the judges, precisely because the judges, as in SCOTUS, but specifically across the land, have been are appointees or have been voted in by electorates across many, many years. So actually have diversity of politics.
They potentially have independence.
Okay.
And
I'm curious. I'm not sure why you're using the word independent when you say there's Democrats here and then there's independents. Like, it just seems like a strange
because
bifurcation that you're making.
what I'm seeing is an unnatural alignment on the blue team. There's no natural diversity of opinion. It's not like Google is sympathetic with Democrats but holds a strongly free speech position, and Twitter is much more interested in censorship.
So I mean, we just we need checks and balances in the system, and you are arguing that it seems like the courts writ large still have enough diversity that they effectively can act as checks and balances, perhaps if need be, as you go up towards the Supreme Court, but that there is very little evidence for checks and balances at this point, as of the end of January. Executive branch, legislative branch, big tech, academia, etc.
Well, so this is what I'm getting at.
Okay.
I think the courts are an unknown. How effective the courts can be in holding back the blue team's power grab, which I think is what we are watching unfold in real time, remains to be seen. But what I would point out is that this view that there are three branches of government, and that's where checks and balances come from, has only one of the branches potentially independent enough to exert a check. And what we have is effectively de facto new branches of government. Now, that's a very imprecise way of saying it, but we have things that exert power as if they were branches of government that are unanticipated in our founding documents. And so, it's a little bit naive to think that, the three branches of government and one of those branches retaining enough independence to exert a check is sufficient in a world where, in effect, what you have is executive, legislative, judicial, but then you also have the so-called fourth estate, the press, which is on the blue team. You have academia, which is on the blue team. You have the deep state, dare I say it, which appears to be on the blue team, and you have big tech, which appears to be on the blue team. Now,
so just you're going to get clipped, but you've been talking about deep state for well over a decade.
Yep.
And it was challenging and irritating at the point that Trump showed up on the scene and started using that language, often imprecisely, as a sort of a political cudgel, rather than as a patriot. And we're well over an hour and a half at this point, I think, so we should really be wrapping it up. But I feel like if you're going to use that phrase in the current environment, you should spend a minute or two saying what you mean by it.
What I'm saying is that there is some entity which is not accountable by virtue of the fact that it's not transparent, so we can't see it, and it's not accountable, and it is, it is the reason that we fight over, things like Snowden and Assange and the things that they have alerted us to. But anyway, there's something which doesn't transition with the shifts in belief structure. There's something that maintains a presence administration after administration. And so anyway, we can argue about the details of it, but I think it's hard to argue about the fact of it. And in any case, it is a powerful force, and it's one that is not anticipated in the Constitution. The Constitution could not have understood the high-tech world of espionage and what would happen when you empower these organizations to start, breaching and bending laws, in the interests of the nation, what they ultimately end up doing. And, we've seen all kinds of shenanigans, like the Five Eyes mechanism for escaping the protections that U.S. citizens are supposed to have from government surveillance, right? This was just a simple shell game, which was if the U.S. government is forbidden to spy on its own citizens, but it is allowed to spy on British citizens, and the British are not allowed to spy on their own citizens, but they can spy on American citizens, then there's an obvious trade, right? Okay? That evades the protection that was supposed to be there. And, it exists. So anyway, I don't want to belabor the point. All I would say is the founding documents are not in a position to protect the values that they correctly highlighted. And the reason that they're not in a position to do it is because the world has changed radically. And so the fact of the judiciary maybe having the power to check the other two branches of government, which are now going to be in the hands of the same party, is reason for hope. But it has to be placed in the context of, yes, but there are these other forces that appear to be in the hands of the same party, and they exert a tremendous force in the other direction. And we're seeing that unfold online over the last 24 hours.
Right. Yeah. Obviously, the most you can ever hope for with regard to the division in a two-party system between three branches of government is 2-1. But your point is that so many of the other forces that are aligned in the world that are extra-governmental are, in fact, living in the same ideology, which is one that is claiming to be liberal, but that we recognize as an extremist branch that is also authoritarian. It's an authoritarian branch of the Democratic Party that is ascending rapidly.
It is ascending rapidly. Mm-hmm. And so I want to make a last point.
Okay.
One of the things that is so troubling about the way the tech platforms work and the way it is interfacing with this power grab and this shoving large numbers of people out the door is that the way they shove you out the door obliterates what you did when you were there. And so it makes the history impossible or nearly impossible to recover. That is to say, initially Facebook, when you decided that it was too toxic and you left, it disappeared you from all the conversations that you had been in. It untagged you in every photograph that you had once been tagged in. And this was a disincentive for people to leave. But now this is turning into a mechanism for allowing one side to shape the narrative falsely, right? So it is difficult. I don't know what the president's sympathies are. I don't trust him. And I think he did encourage the protest at the Capitol. In fact, it's clear that he encouraged it, and what he thought of those who broke in, I can't say. Mm-hmm. But there is a question about whether or not he actually encouraged the breaking of the law. That is much harder to establish because he was clearly abiding by at least a technical standard with respect to what he said. But having disappeared him from Twitter, what you get is the absence of the evidence that one would ordinarily want to go through in order to figure out if what Nancy Pelosi is saying that he said actually came out of his mouth at some point. So my point is that the very fact of the tech platforms not only having the ability to prevent you from speaking going forward, but to effectively erase what you have said, and therefore allows your detractors to imply that you have said things that you may or may not have actually said, that is a very dangerous process. And
it's one with which we should be well familiar from 20th century history, from Orwell's dystopian vision of 20th century history, and more.
Yes, the airbrushing people out of photographs is not a legitimate process under any circumstances.
Right. We probably should be re-upping our looking into alternative platforms just in case.
Just in case.
The purge continues. I mean, maybe it'll stop. Maybe it's already stopped.
Yep. I just can't see that happening. Yeah. But hopefully it will. Hopefully these crazed maniacs will come to their senses and stop the purge and realize what values it is that actually keep the West together. All right.
Yeah. Let's keep talking, even when we disagree, and get outside.
Okay. Be well, everyone. See you next time.